So last time we were talking about how in the years 1820 to 1860, the expectations of women had changed to this doctrine of the spheres, where women were supposed to be domestic and at home and spiritual and moral and superior to men in many different ways. Well, one of the aspects we saw about that was the idea that women were still economically dependent on their husbands, that they didn't have citizenship rights, they couldn't vote, they couldn't testify, they couldn't get divorced, not easily, they couldn't be independent adults. And some women, as we wrote in the last sentence of the notes in the last PowerPoint, reformers who were part of the abolitionist movement felt that this was wrong. And they began a new reform movement, a women's rights movement that started with a document called the Declaration of Sentiments, which was meant to rhyme with the Declaration of Independence. Sentiments in the 1800s meant feelings, strong feelings. A group of 100 people, 68 women, 32 men, some of them husbands to the women, some of them reformers themselves, gathered in 1848 to write this document in a place called Seneca Falls, New York. And we're going to watch a short video from a much longer documentary, about 2 hours long, about women getting the right to vote, that the first 5 minutes or so of the documentary are about this exact meeting and some of the women who helped to start this effort. One of them was, as you can see, a married woman with kids who looks very much like I suspect many parents are looking right now after a week or two of quarantine. Just look at that face with her 2 boys. Her name was Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and we're going to see her again later this semester. Spectacular person. She and another abolitionist named Lucretia Mott had gone to abolitionist meetings and been told basically to sit down and shut up and not speak. And they were outraged about this. And so they declared this meeting, got together 100 people, and wrote the Declaration of Sentiments.
In 1848, this was a progressive town in the heart of the anti-slavery movement. But the women of Seneca Falls were as confined as any in the land. Second-class citizens restricted by law and custom.
Once a woman married, everything that she owned became her husband's. They ceased to exist legally. Women had no rights to their own property. They had no rights to their children. They had no rights to the safety of their own bodies. One of the states upheld the right of a husband to beat his wife, saying that to do otherwise would be to upset the domestic harmony of the home.
Those who dared suggest that women were entitled to equal rights were accused of blasphemy. It was in this climate that the first women's rights meeting was called, at a modest chapel in Seneca Falls. The leader, 32-year-old Elizabeth Cady Stanton, did not look like a revolutionary, but Stanton had been a rebel since childhood. A judge's daughter, she had fought for an education as good as her brothers. Now the wife of a radical abolitionist, Stanton was pushing the fight beyond slavery to demand justice for women as well.
The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries on the part of man toward woman, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her.
For 2 days, the Methodist chapel rang with the voices of 300 women and 40 men, most of them abolitionists already calling for the end of slavery. Now they raised some of the most troubling issues to women: divorce, education, property rights, passing one resolution after the next. Then, the Assembly was thrown into an uproar by Stanton's demand that women be given the right to vote.
For what shall we first petition? For the exercise of our right to the elective franchise. Nothing short of this. The grant of this right will secure all the others.
That was the only thing that was controversial among them. It was so radical. It was such a quintessentially male act by 1848 to vote that they really had to argue among themselves about whether it was okay to put that in, whether that would sink the whole thing.
Women couldn't, by law, vote. But by and large, what was at stake here wasn't just law, it was a whole set of customs and assumptions about the way the world was supposed to be, about what men and women were supposed to be. It was only men, mostly white men, who had the right to vote.
The debate over woman's suffrage went on for hours until abolitionist Frederick Douglass rose in support.
This cause is not exclusively woman's cause. It is the cause of human brotherhood, as well as human sisterhood.
The Seneca Falls Declaration called for the vote in a true democracy where male and female, black and white, would stand together on equal ground. Reaction to the convention was swift. One paper called it an insurrection, another, a congregation of Amazons bolting with a vengeance. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was delighted.
My dear friends, I see that all the journals from Maine to Texas strive with each other to see which can make our movement seem more ridiculous. Imagine all the publicity given to our ideas. It will start women thinking, and men too. And when men and women think, the first step in progress is taken. Good night, Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
And so, with the help of all of the people attending and Frederick Douglass, the great black abolitionist and former slave, the Declaration of Sentiments was written and put out and then reacted to by some Americans. So the next 3 slides are just the text of the Declaration of Sentiments. We'll go through it relatively quickly because you don't have to memorize it, you don't have to copy it, just to know the basic main points that they were trying to make in this declaration. So they began by using the same language as the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, but the key that they changed was that all men and women are created equal, which of course the Declaration of Independence does not say. So this first slide shows us item number 1 about the Declaration of Sentiments is that it was organized around the ideas of what men have deprived women. So again, number 1, it is a list of what men will not allow women to do or have. A list of what men will not allow women to do or have. The Declaration of Independence was a list of what King George had done wrong to us. This was a list of what men had done wrong to women by banning them or taking away rights. So they begin the history of mankind as a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man towards women, establishing tyranny, abuse of power over her. So, among the things men did not allow women to do, first, not allowing women to vote. He has never permitted her to exercise her inalienable right to the franchise. She can't vote. And he has compelled her to submit to laws where she had no voice. And third, he has withheld from her rights given to the most ignorant and degraded men, both natives and foreigners, meaning men can vote, women can't. So, Declaration of Sentiments, first of all, lists all of the rights that were deprived to women by men and male government. Number one, clearly with the first couple of paragraphs combined, not allowing women to vote. And they're demanding that women get the right to vote right now, which is why the voting rights suffrage movement, suffrage means voting rights, is going to go on now from 1848 till 1920. So it's going to be 72 years before they succeed, spoiler alert. Second are that married women have no independence or property rights. Married women do not have independence or property rights. So they're arguing that coverture is abusing women's rights. So that's why the top two say he made her, if married, civilly dead in the eye of the law, taken from her all right and property, even the wages she earns. The video clip that we saw before said that right off the bat, that women don't even own their own salaries or bank accounts. It belongs to their men. She has to promise obedience to her husband. Till the 1900s, the marriage ceremony, the man would vow to love, honor, and cherish his wife. The woman would vow, if she spoke at all, to love, honor, and obey her husband. And the law even gives him power to administer chastisement, which means physical punishment, abuse. You saw that woman Sally in the video clip. She's my favorite because I think she looks like Susan B. Anthony in the 1850s when she is talking on the screen. And then she can be taxed by the government even though she doesn't really own anything of her own. So the fourth, so number one, it's a list of all the abuses of men against women. Number two, women are denied the right to vote. Number three, married women especially are denied their own right to their own property and money. Number four, he has denied her the facilities for obtaining a thorough education. So women deserve access to real education, which it's nice that in 2020 we have this class, which proves that it has come about. So the fourth thing to put down in notes about this is that the Declaration of Sentiments is upset that women are denied access to education. And then the fifth point, he has created a false public sentiment with a different code of morals for men and women. They argue, as point number 5, that the doctrine of the spheres and true womanhood are actually negative for women. The doctrine of the spheres and true womanhood are actually negative for women. It's limiting them. By saying that they are superior morally and spiritually, you're keeping them at home and paying them less when they do go to work. So the doctrine of the spheres and true womanhood are unfair to women, are bad for women. And then they finished off by saying that this destroys women's confidence in her own powers and lessens her own self-respect. So in view of this, we demand that women have immediate admission to all the rights and privileges which belong to them as citizens of the United States. So the last thing about the Declaration of Sentiments, which listed everything that men used to abuse or keep women down, which talked about women not having the vote, which talked about women as married women not having property rights and coverture being wrong, which talked about women not having access to education, which talked about doctrine of the spheres and true womanhood as limiting women and not giving them full freedom. Now they demand full equal women's rights immediately. When this document comes out, it is usually laughed at or mocked or met with scorn by the mainstream. Most mainstream Americans completely ignored it because 1848 was a year when we beat Mexico in the Mexican-American War. People were more excited about war news than news of women's rights. But these arguments and this document inspired a whole generation of new women's rights and suffrage activists. The most famous one of Elizabeth Cady Stanton's closest friends, was a woman named Susan B. Anthony, who we will talk about in detail the week that we talk about voting. So the first ID, the Declaration of Sentiments, is very important. It shows us the first real women's rights movement. They would say later they were inspired by Abigail Adams, who wrote about Remember the Ladies and Let's Give Education to Women and Woman is Lordess. They were inspired by her. And then future feminists would be inspired by these women. It is also an example of how patriarchy is fading in northern states. For women to get together and even remotely have this kind of meeting, let alone to make such a document, is a huge demonstration that patriarchy is not as powerful as it once was. Our last ID of the day and our last ID of the week involves a group that I call as an ID Women of the West, for lack of a better name. Pioneer women, Western migrant women, there's a lot of things you could say. But I call them Women of the West because they were women moving out into the west of the United States to live in new American territory. The women who went west were part of a giant migration, a giant movement of 350,000 Americans moving to territory in the West between 1830 and 1870. This was the time period when we won the Mexican-American War and took over everything all the way to the Pacific Ocean. California, Nevada, Arizona, Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, all of that territory now part of the United States, from sea to shining sea. The time period that they called at the time Manifest Destiny. Why were people moving west? The idea of getting new land was irresistible, especially in the crowded East Coast. New opportunities, maybe an escape from factory work into a different kind of life. And after 1849, a huge motivation was the gold rush in California. That's where the San Francisco 49ers football team gets its name. California was flooded with 100,000 people in 1849, all hoping to get rich quick. Now, what's true about the migrants is that they brought entire families. They uprooted everything they had back east and headed to the west, giving up their entire lives. Most of them were from the north. A lot of Southerners went to Texas and Arizona looking for cotton land, but the majority of these migrants were from the northern areas. So a lot of these women, you see the picture on the right with the woman in the striped dress, are Doctrine of the Sphere's true womanhood women who are now being asked to restart their lives. For women, we'll see a couple of numbered points on the next few slides. This was very rarely their decision. Most of them did not want to go west. Number one, the decision to go west and sell everything back east was almost always made by the men of the family. You'll see a bunch of small print quotes from women in their diaries and letters. Women of the Overland Trail. There are some wonderful books that put all of their feelings down on paper because they wrote a lot of diaries. They were lonely. They were in a kind of quarantine, but the quarantine of the big open spaces going west outside civilization. And women were very honest about how they felt. And most of the time, they felt unhappy. Martha Masterson in The Red Box writes, she begged father to give up the notion, but he could not. Mother finally reluctantly consented to go. Lovers, sweethearts, and associates were all left behind. The saddest parting of all was when my mother took leave of her aged and sorrowing mother. knowing full well they would never meet again on earth. Remember, and we'll see this again in somewhere between points 2 and 5, women were told that their primary social group was supposed to be their friends and family. The doctrine of the spheres said women belonged at home with other women. These women are now saying goodbye to the other people they love most in the world. They don't want to go. Lavina Porter writes, I would make a brave effort to be cheerful and patient until the camp work was done. Then I would start out ahead of the team and my menfolks. When I thought I had gone beyond hearing distance, I would throw myself down on the unfriendly desert and give way like a child to sobs and tears, wishing myself back home with my friends and chiding myself for consenting to take this wild goose chase. Keep in mind, the official owner of the house in Boston or New York or Lowell, Massachusetts was always the man. Women didn't own the property. So if the husband sold the house out from under you, you had no choice. You had to go. Number 2, as I said, if you believe the doctrine of the spheres, you are very upset at leaving behind your female support network and your family. Notice this guy with his 2 sons. Almost everybody on that journey is a woman. A wife, a young woman, looking exhausted with their covered wagons. The trip was very hard. It was like going back in time from the civilized 19th century all the way back to the 17th century to the 1600s. You had to turn into a colonial household manager all over again because everything on the frontier is made from scratch and you don't have anywhere to buy things or have resources. Imagine if one of us had to go back and try to live like the 1800s. We'd be in big trouble. I don't know how to build a fire. I don't know how to make things from scratch. And then there's the things you don't even think about. As Lodisa Frizzell says, all of our work here requires stooping. Not having tables or chairs or anything is very hard on your back. That's why in the picture they're all posed on the ground. That's what you got to sit on. I've cooked so much out in the sun, says Miriam Davis. And the smoke, I hardly know who I am. When I look into my little looking glass, I ask, can this be me? It's a hard journey. It's 6 months of travel over land and eventually the Rocky Mountains. Not an easy trip to take, facing huge rivers like the Mississippi River that have to be crossed. Famine, sun, fevers without a pharmacy, nowhere to buy supplies. What are you going to eat for 6 months? Dried trail mix and beans? Not going to be an easy trip. And you have to worry about floods and freezing in the winter. And patriarchy came back almost entirely. Because the reason patriarchy was fading up north is that your husband was never home. But now you are with your husband all the time. Any of us in quarantine with families know what this is like. And they were saying in an article yesterday, I heard, that in China, now that the quarantines are over, the divorce rate is skyrocketing, which is a very sad statement about what it's like to be trapped with your family in a small space. And that's patriarchy. When the first Saturday came round, I was going to do some of my laundry work, says Esther Lockhart, and Mrs. Norton was an interested spectator because my husband was helping me, and she said the Yankee men are so good to their wives. They help them so much. The South is always much more patriarchal than the North. After that, I frequently noticed Mr. Norton's way of helping his wife. He would stroll in leisurely after his work of his lounging was over, look around critically, peer into the water bucket, and then call out loudly, Mary Jane, I want some water. The bucket's empty. Give me a beer. And poor Mary Jane, weary and uncomplaining, would stop her dinner getting or put down her fretful baby and run to the spring to fetch water for her husband. Her husband was not unkind to her. It was just his way. Casual patriarchy, because when you go back to the 1600s household manager, you also go back to 1600s patriarchy as well. So in the 1800s, patriarchy is fading for women in the North. Patriarchy is fading for the Declaration of Sentiments women. Patriarchy is not fading for women who go west and live with it 100% of the time. But the trip is very dangerous because 10% of the 350,000 people died on the way. For women, it was even more dangerous because being with your husband all the time has a secondary risk that at some point you could end up pregnant once you're in the same bed again or under the same covered wagon. And being at some stage of pregnancy for a long trip or having to birth a child on that long trip without a doctor, without medical facilities, without sanitary conditions is very dangerous. And keeping an eye on the children, Martha Minto, I think now the mothers on the road had to undergo more trial and suffering than anybody else. The men had a great deal of anxiety, but still the mothers had the families. And remember that they didn't make the decision to go. They're just stuck in it, trying to figure out their way through. And poor mother of Catherine Sager wasn't strong enough. She was getting camp fever, sore mouth. She fought against the disease and weakness for the sake of her children. And remember that these same women had to say goodbye to everybody they held dear back home. Last point, once they arrived in the West, even if their husbands died on the way, the one thing most of these women insisted on, if you've ever read or watched Little House on the Prairie, is recreating and reestablishing the doctrine of the spheres, true womanhood, female roles, and society that they had been brought up with. So the top picture is women in these kind of rough wooden shacks in Washington state. The left side picture are women that they called sod busters in Kansas and Nebraska who had to live in a house dug out of the sod, which means a dirt house. You took me away from Boston to live in a house made of dirt. But look, all the people in that picture are women, making the best of it. Like the women in the bottom right. I like them a lot. Those are some women who lived out west by the 1860s, and you see that they had approximated the fashion and the styles that they had back home. I think it's a mother and two daughters, but I'm guessing. I really like the woman on the right, the daughter who's smirking. I like her a lot. But what we see then is that for women of the West, patriarchy returns go back in time, but they didn't forget the doctrine of the spheres that they had been brought up with and tried to maintain it even under difficult conditions. Where we will go next week is the South in the mid-1800s. We saw the North, we saw the West. Now we go to the South and we see the plantations and slavery and a lot of the difficulties that women in that region are going to have. If you're listening to this on time, have a great weekend. If you're not, and you hear it later, I hope you had a great weekend. Don't forget to take your quiz. If you're still in that stage, the quiz goes through March 31st. And I will talk to you again soon next week.